June 1944. Central Pacific. Early morning. The camp wakes before the sun. Heat already presses down on the bamboo barracks. The air smells of damp earth, sweat, and boiled rice stretched thin beyond reason. Men rise slowly, ribs visible beneath sunburned skin. American airmen, once sealed inside aluminum cockpits, now stand barefoot on packed dirt. Outside the fence, guards watch in silence. Some are veterans of China. Others are pilots grounded by injury or age, reassigned to duty they never expected. They have been taught that surrender is disgrace. Hunger, they believe, is deserved. Inside the compound, a parcel appears. A Red Cross package. Rare. Incomplete. Nowhere near enough. Hands reach out, then stop. Food is broken apart. Biscuits cracked in halves. Chocolate shaved into thin fragments. What little there is moves not toward the strongest, but outward, to the sick, the wounded, the men who cannot stand. A guard notices. Then another. They do not intervene. They watch something unfamiliar take shape. Not defiance. Not gratitude. Something quieter. And in that moment, inside a prison camp meant to erase dignity, the war reveals a deeper contradiction that can only be understood by stepping back to how these men came to be here at all. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most unforgiving phase. What began in December 1941 as a rapid Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific had transformed into a grinding, attritional struggle defined by air power, logistics, and exhaustion. The Imperial Japanese Navy had struck first, seizing territory at a speed that shocked the world. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. For a time, it seemed unstoppable. But airfields, not capitals, would decide the next phase of the war. By mid-1942, American strategy in the Pacific hardened around a single principle: advance by air. Aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and island bases would be used to cut Japan's perimeter apart piece by piece. Each captured atoll became a launch point. Each runway shortened the distance to the Japanese home islands. The men inside the prison camps were a direct result of this strategy. American pilots, naval aviators, Marine flyers, and Army Air Force's bomber crews were being pushed ever closer to heavily defended skies. Missions grew longer. Anti-aircraft fire thickened. Japanese fighters became more aggressive as fuel shortages forced decisive engagements. Losses increased, and with them, the number of airmen who did not die over the ocean but fell instead onto enemy-held land. For Japanese doctrine, this created a problem no regulation fully addressed. The Imperial Japanese military was shaped by a strict interpretation of Bushido, the warrior ethic that elevated death in service above all else. Surrender was not merely a failure, it was a moral collapse. Soldiers were taught that capture erased honor, family, and identity. This belief did not apply only to Japanese soldiers. It defined how enemies were viewed as well. An American airman who survived being shot down was not seen as fortunate. He was seen as incomplete. Yet by 1943 and 1944, the number of captured Allied airmen was growing too large to ignore. Raids over Rabaul, the Solomons, New Guinea, the Marianas, and later the Japanese home islands themselves produced survivors. Parachutes were spotted. Inflatable rafts were recovered. Some men were rescued by Japanese patrols. Others were handed over by civilians. Few were prepared for what awaited them. Captured airmen were initially processed through interrogation centers run by the Kempeitai, Japan's military police. These interrogations varied widely. Some were methodical and cold, others violent and chaotic, but their purpose was consistent: extract intelligence quickly, then remove the prisoners from the front lines. From there, airmen were sent to camps scattered across Japan, Formosa, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Some camps were purpose-built. Others were repurposed schools, warehouses, or factory compounds. Conditions depended heavily on location, local commanders, and a shifting availability of supplies. By 1944, those supplies were failing. Japan's merchant fleet had been gutted by American submarines. Rice harvests fell. Urban populations faced rationing. Military units at the front survived on starvation diets. Prisoner camps, already low priority, slipped even further down the list. Food became power. Rations issued to prisoners often amounted to little more than polished rice, occasionally supplemented by watery vegetable soup or scraps of fish. Protein was rare. Vitamins non-existent. Diseases, beriberi, dysentery, scurvy, spread quickly among men already weakened by crash landings, wounds, and months of captivity. And yet, even within this system of deprivation, moments occurred that no training manual had prepared Japanese personnel to understand. Because the Americans did not behave as expected. They did not hoard food when it appeared. They did not fight each other for survival. And when rare outside supplies arrived, Red Cross parcels smuggled vegetables, shared scraps, they divided them. This behavior, small and almost invisible, clashed directly with everything Japanese military culture had taught about enemies, weakness, and honor. To understand why these moments carried such weight, it is necessary to step inside the prison camp system itself and examine how it was meant to function. Japanese prisoner-of-war camps during the Pacific War were not designed with rehabilitation in mind. They were administrative afterthoughts, shaped less by formal policy than by ideology, scarcity, and distance from oversight. Officially, Japan was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, but crucially, it had never ratified it. This distinction mattered. Without legal obligation, camp conditions were governed by internal military regulations that emphasized control, discipline, and deterrence rather than welfare. Captured airmen entered a system that viewed them through a moral lens before a legal one. In many camps, prisoners were classified not by rank or nationality, but by perceived threat. Airmen, particularly bomber crews, were often placed at the top of that hierarchy. They represented industrial warfare from the sky. Incendiaries, explosives, civilian casualties. To many guards and interrogators, these men were not simply soldiers. They were symbols of destruction. Food allocation reflected this perception. Japanese camp rations mirrored those issued to lower-ranking soldiers, which by 1944 had already dropped below subsistence levels. Prisoners were expected to survive on these rations while performing labor, clearing rubble after air raids, unloading supplies, or working in factories. Weight loss was universal. Medical care was minimal. Red Cross inspections, when they occurred at all, were infrequent and often staged. The guards themselves were not immune to hardship. Many were older reservists or wounded veterans. Some had been pilots, mechanics, or naval crewmen reassigned after injuries grounded them. They lived on similar rations. They watched their own cities burn under Allied bombing. Morale declined as the war turned against Japan. This created an environment of tension rather than simple cruelty. Japanese military training emphasized absolute obedience, endurance, and collective survival. Individual comfort was secondary to group cohesion. In such a system, food was not a personal resource. It was a measure of discipline. To share food without orders was unnecessary. To give it away voluntarily made little sense. Among the prisoners, however, a different logic prevailed. American airmen had been trained under a code that emphasized unit responsibility. Crew survival depended on mutual support. In flight, men trusted each other with their lives. On the ground, that instinct persisted. When food appeared, whether from Red Cross parcels, barter, or rare camp distributions, it was often pooled. This practice was neither organized rebellion nor conscious moral protest. It was habit. Medical officers among the prisoners frequently advised that limited protein or vitamins be given first to the sick. Crew chiefs and senior NCOs sometimes supervised distribution quietly, without challenge or ceremony. No speeches were made. No gestures toward guards were intended. But the guards noticed. They saw men breaking apart meager rations and passing them to others who could no longer stand during roll call. They saw food being set aside for prisoners with dysentery or malaria. They saw chocolate, a rarity, melted into rice water and shared across a barack. This behavior contradicted the Japanese military's expectations of captives. Prisoners, according to doctrine, were supposed to embody failure. They were meant to be weak, selfish, and ashamed. Yet what unfolded inside the camps suggested discipline without coercion, solidarity without command. 4 Japanese personnel raised to believe that surrender erased honor and humanity. This was deeply unsettling. Some guards interpreted it as deception. Others saw it as madness. A few, particularly former pilots, recognized something else, a code different from their own, but no less rigid. These quiet moments did not end suffering. They did not alter rations or policy, but they planted doubt, small, persistent, and difficult to suppress. And as the air war intensified and Japan's situation worsened, those doubts began to matter in ways no one inside the camps could yet foresee. The story now turns from systems to perspectives, from structure to experience, examining the same events through different lenses that reveal why such simple acts carried extraordinary weight. The human, cultural, and psychological perspectives. The human angle, hunger and choice. Hunger strips life to essentials. Inside the camps, it was constant. Not the sharp pain of a missed meal, but the dull erosion of weeks without enough calories. Men learned to measure days by weakness, by how long it took to stand during roll call, by whether hands shook when lifting a tin cup. In such conditions, food became more than nourishment. It became survival itself. And yet, time after time, American prisoners chose to divide it. This was not romantic altruism. It was practical humanity. A man too weak to stand endangered everyone during inspections. A sick prisoner could spread disease across a barack. Survival, the prisoners understood, was collective. Sharing food preserved strength where it mattered most. 4 Japanese guards observing this, the act defied expectations. Hunger, in their training, was a test of individual endurance. A soldier was expected to endure silently, not redistribute suffering. Giving away food voluntarily suggested control over fear, something hunger was meant to induce. The sight unsettled them precisely because it was quiet. The cultural angle, 2 military worlds. The Imperial Japanese military culture placed supreme value on sacrifice to authority. Orders flowed downward. Loyalty was vertical. Survival was secondary to obedience. American military culture, particularly among air crews, emphasized horizontal trust. Pilots, navigators, gunners, and engineers survived together or not at all. Their bond was functional, not ideological. This difference surfaced inside the camps. Japanese guards expected hierarchy among prisoners to collapse. Rank, they believed, lost meaning after surrender. Yet within the barracks, informal leadership persisted. Senior enlisted men maintained order. Medical officers triaged care. Pilots deferred to crew chiefs. Structure remained, even without authority. Food sharing reinforced that structure. To Japanese observers, this discipline without enforcement was deeply confusing. It resembled obedience, but no officer gave the command. The psychological angle, shattering assumptions. Japanese propaganda portrayed Allied airmen as decadent, selfish, and morally hollow. They were said to fight for pay, not honor. Their willingness to surrender was proof of weakness. But behavior inside the camps contradicted the narrative. Men who had surrendered under impossible circumstances still upheld mutual responsibility. They accepted deprivation without collapsing into chaos. They shared what little they had without expectation of reward. For some guards, especially those who had flown combat missions themselves, the contradiction was personal. They had been taught that only Japanese soldiers possessed true discipline. Yet here were enemy airmen, starving, beaten, and powerless, demonstrating restraint and cohesion under conditions meant to erase it. This did not inspire admiration in the open. It inspired silence. A silence that widened as the war dragged on. Air raids intensified, and certainty became harder to maintain. Those silences, however, were not confined to observation alone. They intersected with leadership decisions, enemy perception, and moral boundaries that would soon be tested more severely than ever. Leadership, enemy perception, and moral fracture. The leadership angle, orders versus reality. Japanese camp leadership operated under contradictory pressures. On paper, commanders were instructed to maintain order, extract labor, and prevent escape. They were not encouraged to foster brutality for its own sake, but neither were they given resources to ensure humane treatment. Food shortages, medical collapse, and growing resentment toward prisoners blurred the line between discipline and neglect. Camp officers understood one thing clearly: prisoners were supposed to be broken. Yet food sharing undermined that goal. When American prisoners redistributed rations, they neutralized one of the few tools camp authorities possessed: scarcity as control. Hunger was meant to isolate men psychologically. Instead, it reinforced cohesion. Attempts to punish this behavior often backfired, provoking quiet resistance or further solidarity. Some commanders chose to ignore it. Others recorded it in reports, noting unusual prisoner discipline or unexpected cooperation. These observations rarely traveled far up the chain of command, but they accumulated at the local level, shaping how camps were run in subtle ways. The enemy angle, the pilots watching. Among the guards were men who had once flown aircraft themselves. Grounded pilots, injured, reassigned, or no longer fit for combat, were often posted to rear area duties, including prison supervision. They had faced American airmen in the sky. Some had lost comrades to Allied guns. Others had watched bombers pass overhead, untouchable. For them, captivity stripped away distance. They saw the enemy close up, thin, dirty, human. When these guards observed prisoners sharing food, it struck at something personal. They recognized the behavior. Air crews survived by mutual reliance. They had lived by similar rules before the war turned against them. This recognition was dangerous. To acknowledge discipline in the enemy meant acknowledging equality. And equality contradicted everything they had been taught. Some guard hardened. Others softened quietly. A few looked away. The moral angle, quiet defiance without resistance. Food sharing was not rebellion. No slogans accompanied it. No protests were made. Prisoners did not demand better treatment. They simply refused to abandon one another. This quiet defiance carried moral weight precisely because it did not seek recognition. It did not challenge authority openly. It simply persisted. Japanese guards struggled to categorize it. It was not insubordination. It was not sabotage. It was not surrender. It existed in a space the system had not anticipated. As Japan's strategic situation deteriorated, cities burning, supply lines collapsing, air raids multiplying, this unclassifiable behavior became harder to dismiss. It did not change the course of battles, but it changed perceptions. And as the war approached its most desperate phase, these small acts would intersect with events far larger than any single camp, reaching a point where belief systems themselves began to fracture. That fracture would occur not gradually, but under pressure. When scarcity peaked, bombing intensified, and the outcome of the war could no longer be denied. When small acts met strategic pressure. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a fever pitch. American air power, now fully industrialized and relentlessly applied, struck deep into Japanese-held territories. The Marianas, including Saipan and Tinian, became staging grounds for B-29 raids. Japanese pilots, already stretched thin, faced increasingly sophisticated opposition. Every mission carried the risk of being shot down over enemy territory, captured, or killed. For the men who survived these missions but were captured, life in the camps had grown harsher. Supplies had dwindled to near nothing. Rice rations were half of what they had been the year before. Vegetables were almost non-existent. Protein, a luxury, rarely reached the barracks. Disease spread unchecked. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi incapacitated men by the dozens. It was in this crucible that small acts of human decency took on extraordinary significance. One documented example comes from the Amori camp near Tokyo, early in 1945. Here, a group of down B-29 crewmen received a single Red Cross parcel between 20 men. Instead of dividing it equally by rank or speed of consumption, the men pooled the food, ensuring that the weakest, including men stricken with dysentery, received the first portions. Guards observed in silence as chocolate and biscuits, enough for only one man, were shared among many. Another instance occurred in the camps near Fukuoka, where U.S. Navy aviators captured after raids over Kyushu distributed dried fruit and powdered milk to men who could barely stand. Some guards, themselves suffering from hunger and fatigue, reportedly stopped eating for the day to watch the process. In both cases, Japanese officers struggled to classify what they were witnessing. It did not fit the language of the military reports they were trained to write. It was not rebellion. It was not cowardice. It was a quiet, methodical preservation of humanity. For the prisoners, the act was instinctive. It drew upon the same bonds forged in the air, a shared understanding that survival depended on solidarity. No one outside the barracks could enforce compliance or discipline. No one needed to, yet the effect rippled outward. Among guards who had once flown missions themselves, this behavior provoked recognition and doubt. Witnessing discipline and selflessness in those they had been taught to despise challenged the ideological foundation of their own training. These moments, though small in isolation, occurred against the backdrop of escalating Allied pressure. American bombers were reaching Tokyo itself. Cities were burning. Morale was faltering. The Japanese military was facing logistical collapse. Inside the camps, the convergence of scarcity, fear, and the prisoners' quiet defiance created a tension that reached its apex when Allied air raids intensified over central Japan in spring 1945. Guards, already questioning strategy and purpose, faced prisoners who continued to act with order, restraint, and humanity under conditions that should have reduced them to desperation. It was here, in this collision of ideology, survival, and small-scale morality, that the narrative of the stunned Japanese observers crystallized. The war had stripped the environment to essentials: food, obedience, survival, and conscience. And in that stripped world, small acts carried outsized weight. Stunned observers and the fracture of belief. Spring 1945. The Amori and Fukuoka camps had become microcosms of an impossible reality. Japanese guards, many former pilots or combat veterans, watched American airmen maintain dignity and cohesion under conditions that should have obliterated it. One officer's report from Fukuoka, later captured by Allied forces, described the behavior as unaccountable calm. Prisoners ration what little they have with care, not for themselves, but for those too weak to claim it. The language betrays disbelief. It was not possible, he seemed to think, for men to act with such order while starving. At Amori, similar observations were made. Guards noted how men would distribute chocolate shavings across barracks, dissolve sugar into scant water, and even wait to allow those suffering from illness the first sip of thin rice soup. I could not understand, one guard recorded in his diary, why they do this when they could simply take it for themselves. These behaviors coincided with one of the most critical periods of the Pacific Air Campaign. B-29 raids over Japanese cities were daily events. Firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe burned under waves of incendiary bombs. Prisoners witnessed the destruction from a distance, and guards witnessed both the devastation and the calm resilience of their captives. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Japanese doctrine emphasized that weakness invited punishment, that surrender was shame, and that the enemy could only be degraded, not dignified. Yet here were Americans who had surrendered, emaciated, and still demonstrating a moral code that the guards could not reconcile with their training. This quiet resistance, sharing food, aiding the sick, maintaining internal discipline, became a subtle turning point within the microcosm of captivity. It did not win battles or change strategic outcomes, but it eroded psychological certainty. Guards began to question long-held assumptions, about honor, about enemies, about themselves. In some camps, small gestures of trust were extended across fences. A guard might allow a sick prisoner a piece of bread without being watched. Another might hesitate to enforce a punitive rule when he saw the careful way prisoners had shared rations. These decisions were minor individually, but collectively they signaled a fracture in the rigid moral and military structure the Japanese forces had upheld for decades. The ultimate turning point came as the Allied advance accelerated. The Marianas had fallen. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were under assault. Supply lines were collapsing. Air superiority, once contested, was firmly in Allied hands. The Japanese military, and with it its camp administration, faced inevitable defeat. By the time Japan announced surrender in August 1945, the camps had become a quiet testament to a different kind of victory, the persistence of order, discipline, and humanity even in defeat. Japanese personnel left behind accounts noting how the airmen's conduct confounded all training and revealed a strength beyond starvation. These small, deliberate acts, breaking bread, sharing chocolate, caring for the sick, had done what strategy and weapons could not. They challenged assumptions, exposed ideological rigidity, and left an indelible impression on those who believed the enemy had none. And as the war ended, those impressions would shape not only post-war reflection, but the moral memory of captivity itself, setting the stage for the aftereffects that would follow in liberation and reconciliation. Liberation and the immediate human cost. August 1945. The war ended with a shock that reverberated across the Pacific. Cities lay in ruins, naval fleets were shattered, and the Japanese military apparatus collapsed almost overnight. Within the prison camps, the silence after the surrender announcement was profound. Liberation came slowly. Allied occupation forces, advancing from the south and via air transport, began inspecting and securing camps across Japan, Korea, Formosa, and occupied territories. The first encounters between liberators and prisoners were cinematic in their intensity. Emaciated men stepping out of sun-baked barracks, eyes wide at the sudden absence of armed guards, at the sudden access to abundant food and clean water. In Amori, Fukuoka, and elsewhere, American airmen received their first full rations in months. The disparity was staggering. Where a man had subsisted on a single rice ball and a scrap of fish, he now found chocolate bars, canned meat, and fresh fruit. The Red Cross parcels that had been rare and carefully rationed were now delivered en masse. The human toll of captivity became starkly visible. Weight loss averaged 20 to 30% of pre-capture body mass. Disease had claimed dozens. Dysentery, scurvy, beriberi, and malaria had debilitated nearly all survivors. Many could not walk more than a few hundred meters without collapsing. Medical officers immediately began triage and treatment, often astonished at the resilience displayed by men who, under ordinary circumstances, would have succumbed to starvation. Survivors' testimonies later highlighted one recurring detail. The food-sharing rituals that had persisted throughout captivity had, in many cases, saved lives. A senior officer from the 5th Air Force recalled that distributing small portions of chocolate and rice to those too weak to stand during roll call kept entire barracks from succumbing to malnutrition-related deaths. It wasn't just generosity, he said decades later. It was survival strategy. And it worked. Japanese guards and former officers, meanwhile, began writing reports and diaries that captured their astonishment. Some, especially those who had served as pilots, admitted that they had never expected their captives to maintain such discipline and humanity under extreme deprivation. Their reflections often noted confusion, respect, and even guilt, emotions rarely admitted in wartime documents. In the broader context of the Pacific War, these camps remained minor in scale compared to cities obliterated by firebombs or battles like Okinawa. Yet their significance lay in human terms. Moments of moral clarity in an otherwise brutal conflict. The liberation of prisoners was not the end of consequences. While the men regained freedom, they carried scars, physical, psychological, and emotional. The trauma of starvation, disease, and witnessing both cruelty and unexpected decency would linger long after the war's end. The story of what had unfolded inside the camps, particularly the sharing of food and its effects on Japanese observers, was preserved in after-action reports, survivor memoirs, and post-war testimonies. These accounts formed a record that would challenge the more conventional narratives of enmity and ideological superiority. And yet, the broader consequences of captivity were not solely human. They influenced post-war policies, trials for war crimes, and the reconciliation processes that followed. How the camps were remembered would hinge as much on the moral acts inside as on the atrocities elsewhere. War crimes, memory, and the enduring impact. The formal aftermath of captivity extended beyond liberation. Allied forces documented conditions in camps, assessing compliance or violation of international norms. While Japan had not ratified the Geneva Convention, the Allies treated mistreatment of prisoners as a serious matter. Investigations revealed widespread starvation, forced labor, and neglect. Yet even amid these findings, the stories of humane behavior, food sharing, mutual care, and selfless acts were consistently highlighted. They provided a counterpoint to the brutality, a reminder of human resilience. In post-war tribunals, such as the Yokohama and Tokyo war crimes trials, testimonies from surviving airmen and naval personnel became critical evidence. Witnesses described not only harsh treatment, but also moments where Japanese guards were confused or hesitant because prisoners continued to act with discipline and moral cohesion. Some judges and prosecutors noted that these observations helped differentiate between premeditated cruelty and structural failure caused by scarcity and chaos. Former Japanese officers later reflected privately on these experiences. Diaries and interviews collected in the 1950s reveal a striking pattern. Many were impressed by the quiet determination of their captives. One pilot recalled, "They ate little, yet they fed others first. I could not understand it then. Now, I see it as strength I lacked in myself." Such statements illustrate the psychological impact these acts of sharing had on observers trained to see the enemy as weak or dishonorable. For the survivors, the moral lessons of captivity endured. The act of sharing, once a necessity born from training and solidarity, became emblematic of the difference between survival and humanity. Memoirs emphasize that even in a system designed to dehumanize, simple gestures of care could preserve dignity, strengthen morale, and save lives. The war had ended, but the lessons of these camps echoed beyond the immediate aftermath. U.S. military manuals later incorporated insights on group cohesion and prisoner care, noting that the survival of personnel often depended as much on social bonds as on equipment or strategy. Psychologists studying post-war trauma emphasize that acts of mutual support among prisoners mitigated long-term mental deterioration. Furthermore, the moral shock experienced by Japanese personnel influenced post-war reconciliation. Accounts of stunned guards, confounded by the airmen's conduct, contributed to narratives of shared humanity that eased dialogue between former enemies. In memoirs, interviews, and historical analyses, these moments became symbols, proof that respect, discipline, and decency could exist even amid conflict, and that human behavior could defy ideological expectations. Ultimately, the aftermath of the camps was twofold. Tangible, weakened bodies restored, wartime atrocities documented, trials conducted. Intangible, lessons etched into memory, perceptions challenged, ethical truths revealed. Food, shared quietly in the shadows of barbed wire, became more than nourishment. It became a medium through which morality, discipline, and humanity spoke louder than guns or doctrine. Even as Japan faced occupation, reconstruction, and reflection, the legacy of these acts persisted. They reminded all involved, survivors and captors alike, that in a world designed to strip men of identity, choice, and dignity, the simplest acts could echo far beyond the confines of a single barrack. War is often measured in strategy, territory, and casualty figures. Yet some of the most profound moments occur not on the battlefield, but in quiet, unexpected corners. Inside Japanese prison camps, American airmen faced the extremes of hunger, disease, and isolation. Every ration was scarce. Every scrap of food could have been consumed by oneself. And yet they shared it. This simple act, breaking a biscuit, dissolving chocolate into water, offering the first spoonful of soup to the sick, became a defiance of expectation. Not a loud rebellion, but a moral assertion. A reminder that humanity can persist even when institutions are designed to strip it away. For Japanese guards and former pilots, the impact was seismic. They had been trained to see surrender as shame, weakness as inevitable, and the enemy as morally inferior. Observing prisoners act with discipline, solidarity, and care challenged their assumptions. It planted doubt in rigid belief systems, revealing that courage and honor were not exclusive to any one nation or ideology. The legacy of these moments extends beyond history books. They demonstrate that morality is not always dictated by circumstance or power. It can be chosen quietly, even when the stakes are survival itself. A single shared morsel of food, in such a context, carries weight far greater than its physical substance. It embodies dignity, courage, and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. As the Pacific War drew to a close, bombs fell, empires collapsed, and cities burned. Yet inside the shadowed barracks, simple acts of sharing persisted. They remind us that, even amid the machinery of war, humanity can endure, and that sometimes it is in the smallest gestures that history finds its most enduring echoes.